Thank you, Angus. And thank you especially to Bill and Andrew for our conversation today. What a blessing. According to Craig's mytho history theory of Adam, Adam and Eve were the first humans, but their story was told in the figurative language of myth, quoting his book. And it's futile, or probably futile, to discern what parts are historical and what parts not. Although there's much in this book that I like, I'm just going to focus on the flaws, and that way we can have a more rigorous conversation. Flaw number one, it's applied to the Old Testament inconsistently. So in your handout you see a list of 10 traits from Craig's book as I categorize them. And so he thinks that Gen 1 to 11 has 8 of these 10 myth traits. But in his book, he says 3 times that Gen 12 through 50 does not look like myth, that doesn't have these traits. But I think he applies this inconsistently because if we look, let's just take a sample of Genesis 17 to 18 from this larger context of 12 to 50. Now in Gen 17, we've got ritual circumcision. We have the origin story of that. And now Craig does not deal with chapter 17, but he takes a smaller sample, chapter 18, and notes that there he thinks that God could very well have had a physically embodied temporary form and ate with Abraham, and that this is not fantastic. But he thinks that God making a walking sound in the garden and some other things that went on, that this was not a temporary physical appearance of God, but rather is characteristic of what he calls the trait of fantastic, which indicates a mythical story, or at least partially mythical story. So now, the thing is that if you take a little bit larger sample than just 18, but look at 17 and 18, then you have 9 of the 10 myth traits. And so this, if Craig were to be consistent, would be even more myth-like than just taking a smaller sample of 18 or Genesis 1 through 11. Would be even more myth-like than Genesis 1 to 11. One of the traits that Gen 17 through 18 and the larger context lacks is the trait of correspondences between deities and nature. But we do find this in the Exodus account, where we have arguably all 10 traits, as Craig categorizes them, in the account, including this correspondences. For example, the darkness was judging the sun god, and there were other correspondences as well. And of course, you have the ritual origin of Passover. Second flaw, it uses excessive literalism to argue for the fantastic trait of myth in Gen 1 to 11. Now, Jack Collins, who I rely on extensively in my talk, he argues that Gen 3, and I agree, this text allows for a real literal snake manipulated by an evil power, and that this is not a trait of fantastic myth. Craig thinks this is fantastic because Gen 3 literally says the snake is more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. And he further makes the point that we all agree on, that ancient Jews knew snakes don't talk. So they would have found such a description fantastic, that is, a myth trait. But Collins and I think that, well, of course snakes don't talk, and ancient people knew that. So if one does, then they would know it results from some kind of interference, such as in Balaam's donkey. So Collins and I oppose Craig's excessive literalism that triggers the fantastic myth trait, which then triggers a full-blown, non-literal, totally or almost totally figurative interpretation of Genesis. So this excessive use of literalism is further illustrated by Craig noting that the snake slithering on the ground is a consequence of God's judgment. Whereas Collins and I say, well, that's a little bit too literal of a reading, because Collins argues that to go on the belly describes the cringing of a beaten foe. There's a figurative expression. And eating dust is figuratively shows the humiliation and defeat. And so this still can be a literal evil-possessed snake. And so Collins and I oppose Craig's fantastic and therefore myth conclusion about this passage. Third flaw, Craig's theory contradicts New Testament texts that depend on Gen 2 as real history, such as 1 Corinthians 11, which he says is a purely literary way to illustrate some teaching. Now, Paul said that man was not made from woman, but woman from man, and Craig thinks that Paul did not intend for us to think that that actually happened, but that's just a made-up story that illustrates some important truth. David Garland says Paul did intend that in his commentary, and that through the creation, that he interprets, Paul interprets Gen 1 through the creation account of Gen 2, and he makes his points based on that man was created first and then the woman out of him. Gordon Fee makes a similar point. He says, in the creation narrative, this didn't happen the other way around, man from woman for her sake. Hence, he is her head, her source of origin. So this narrative talks about that Eve's source of origin is Adam. So I think it leans on Eve having actually originated from Adam. And Collins, and even Craig, makes the argument that Romans 5 does depend on a narrative of Adam's sin. And Collins actually uses that term, the narrative of Adam's sin. And as a result, something happened, namely the death consequence of our sin. So I think that Craig is inconsistent to argue like this about Romans 5, but not about 1 Corinthians 11. And so that's my challenge to him, is to think that through. Because I think that 1 Corinthians 11 also relies on Eve derived from Adam that had a real result outside of just the narrative itself, namely proper gender relations. And Cambridge theologian John Lyas once wrote that as woman is of man by creation, so is the man of the woman by birth. And this parallel by creation and by birth makes the most sense, that both are real world events with real effects. So this Gen 2 Eve from Adam thing, Collins and I think was real history. And in fact, it ends with the conclusion, therefore a man shall leave his father and so on, get married, right? So that's the conclusion of a historical narrative argument. Paul Roth argues that sometimes only a historical narrative can thoroughly explain something, and I think this is a good case of that. So here we have a narrative of a sequence of events alleged to have happened. Adam made from dust, he names the animals, loss of a little bit of his side, he gains Eve, and thus the conclusion, therefore get married, right? That's the application for us today. A story with very high applicability, right? For better life. My wife is on the front row, so there you go. So yes, the sequence, Collins and I think that this is an actual historical sequence. It's in a narrative, of course, but we don't think it's a literary fiction in the sense of that the sequence of events is not fictional but real. Craig thinks that there's some real teaching here, but the sequence itself did not actually happen in real history, but was a made-up story, a myth-type story. So the event sequence, I think, explains the origin of proper human sexuality, that we're not derived from animals, so we're not like animals, which even ancient Near Eastern people knew had multiple mates, right? Now, today we also know that animals engage in same-sex acts, which maybe the ancients did not know about. So myth of history can't carry this explanatory load, but real history can. Jesus himself used Gen 2, referred to it, and the Eve from Adam sequence was a part of that story that ends with the conclusion, therefore, marriage with a high view of marriage, not a low, like animalistic, multiple mate type of marriage. And he even identifies the narrator of the story as the creator, which of course is him, right? And so he's quoting himself here, if you will, and concluding the argument, and it's a historical narrative argument. So he was arguing against the Pharisees who were arguing for easy divorce, which would give multiple mates. And this violates the foundation of marriage because Jesus said from the beginning it was not so. Collins points out that this from the beginning means before the fall. In other words, real events in history. And I think, and Collins agrees with me that this sequence of events was not a crafted story just to illustrate the truth, but really happened of Adam, Eve made from Adam. So now, so Craig thinks that Jesus used a literary Adam that might have some historical core to it, but the Eve derived from Adam part of that narrative that he cites, of course, Craig does not think is historical. Now, Jesus did say, have you not read, or have you read, right? Referring to the narrative of Genesis 2. But Craig thinks that that sort of could give him room to say, well, Jesus is only referring to the story and not really to history. But Jesus used the exact same have you not read expression, the same Greek word, when he referred to David's acts and using those as a premise in an argument and draws a conclusion, not from a mere literary mytho-historical David, but from a real historical David. And he did this, Jesus actually made 4 arguments in Matthew where he used the same Greek word. And each time I think it's plausible, most plausible, that he's referring to real history. So in summary, Jesus and Paul depend on Gen 2 as for historical premises, including the Adam derived from Eve, which is important for the sanctity of marriage. Now, the 4th flaw that I see in Craig's theory is its description of myth is highly contested. Now, in other words, Craig in his book says 6 times that myth, the language of myth, that's what myth is, or the language of myth is figurative. Whereas Dr. French, who we introduced later on the end here of the row, he and I have talked about this a lot, that myth often uses figurative and literal language to refer to real events, or the events that were thought to be real, at least by those who told the stories. So now in your handout, I've listed Craig's 10 myth traits, and I've classified them in a way that makes a point. I'll leave that to you for homework to see the classification. Let me just draw the conclusion for the sake of time. But once you look at that classification system of his 10 traits, here's the conclusion you can draw. That the mytho-history conclusion of his book, drawing from the 10 traits, depends on the fantastic trait. Because all the other alleged myth traits that he finds in Gen 1 to 11 are also widely found throughout the Old Testament. And so, and then the one myth trait that's so important, the fantastic trait, it depends on his excessive literalism, which is arbitrarily and inconsistently used to trigger the fantastic trait. And Collins and I argue that this is not a good approach. So Craig's theory scores low in evidence. It's particularly biblical evidence about the New Testament use of the Old Testament, which Angus alluded to as an important way of applying the theoretical virtues, and it also scores low in coherence. And so I use the word consistency or inconsistency to refer to coherence or the lack thereof by the way he identifies the fantastic trait by ad hoc excessive literalism. Uses it here, but maybe not somewhat over here. Now, as to Locke's theory, Locke believes that humans descended from Adam and Eve and thousands of evolved human-like animals, which he identifies as non-human anatomical Homo. I find 2 problems with this that I have time to talk about. First, it has a theologically implausible account of humans mating with human-like animals. We'll start there. Basically, it's animal plus human equals love plus all human children. Okay? So now Cain, or someone later, pioneered this way to spread the image of God, and according to Locke's theory, and that this, because all the children had God's image, and according to his theory, were human. And so God's image, which is our ability to represent God by the functions and capacities for global dominion, and a list of other things that he'll read in his paper, this image differentiates us from animals. Now, Locke thinks that regarding Cain's wife, or whoever invented first interbreeding with animals, but let's just take Cain's wife for simplicity. If she was an animal, then Locke initially would say, well, she didn't have the image of God, so there you go. But then he worries about the gap between the husband and wife. We're talking a really big gap, so it would seem. So to help diminish this gap, maybe make the marriage a little better, maybe the wife lacked one or some of the image of God traits, he speculates. And maybe Cain was somewhat primitive. I actually uses the phrase quite primitive. Now, Gen 4, I think, defeats the quite primitive thesis. And so Cain knew God didn't like his actions. He knew his brother's actions were better than his. And he even engaged in witty sarcasm, right? That last quote. And a few other traits that surface in the narrative. Now later, after the time of the publication of his book in 22, he responded to Craig. They've had some interesting dialogue, and in that dialogical context, he actually wanted to widen the gap between Cain and his wife, as a case study here. And so he says, well, look, God's image in Cain made him qualitatively different, spiritually and morally, from people who weren't, such as his wife, if it were indeed an animal wife. An animal person, but not a human person. So I find this inconsistency, depending on the dialogical context of his speaking or writing, that he engages in different. It's inconsistent, so a little bit of incoherence here. Now, Locke's occasional and inconsistent claim of Cain was primitive is, I think, incompatible with the Bible, particularly the sudden, full appearance of the image of God. And this animal-human mating thing, which is central to this theory, scores low in evidence and coherence for reasons I have given. Now, is Locke's theory racist? Now, Locke says, and he actually addresses this explicitly, he says, my theory is not racist because, quote, all anatomical homo today are human beings from a common ancestor and are equally valued as God's image bearers. So, if you look around, everyone who looks human is human. That's basically the idea. We're all in God's image and we have equal value. But his theory, I think, is racist with regard to ancient human communities, which included animal spouses. So, like mom or dad, one of them's not a human. So these persons are less valuable than persons with God's image. So I think Locke's theory is racist with regarding not to today, but with regarding to ancient human communities. Second flaw, it has a delayed universality of the human family, which doesn't cohere well with the Bible story. So there was a pivotal event in his theory, sometime before the time of Christ, where the extinction of the last human-like animal, we'll just call him or her X, okay? This is really an X, okay? Who had sex with humans and made all human kids, like I mentioned earlier. Now, Locke has several options for how this could happen, and he's open to all of them. God could have created Adam and Eve without using evolution, and then made them sexually compatible with X. He could have upgraded very advanced human-like animals to make them human, and also to keeping them sexually compatible with X, or some combination of the above. And he's also open to Eve being derived from Adam, unlike Craig. So, on any of these options, God originally planned for some Adam and Eve progeny to mate with X, the animal, okay? That looked almost exactly like humans, but didn't have the image of God. So if God intended otherwise, then I think it would have been most fitting for God to make Adam and Eve reproductively incompatible with X. So, why do I think this? Because I think this whole animal spouse thing is implausible theologically. Human children with one animal parent would have morally and spiritually deficient nurturing, which is something he did not address in his book. Would God have planned for this? No, definitely not. Because God is consistent with his own attributes, such as his wisdom. Okay? That God chooses the best goals for the best, and the best means to achieve them in his love. So it's not a wise original plan. Indeed. So human families, of course, went into sin and nosedived, but that kind of spiritual deficiency in families was not a part of God's original plan, but would be, I think, on Locke's theory. So that's a problem. So this delayed universality of the human family is also deficient in the narrative virtues. In the handout, I have a parallel between the theoretical virtues and what I call the narrative virtues, which are the traits of a good story. And so, for example, consistency, it's on the theoretical side is you can't be illogical. Consistency in a story means, even though your characters have different views, you still have a consistent message that's being delivered. Livability is a really big one. In science, if your theology is high in virtues of theory, then you can have a better life if you actually live out your theology. And livability in a story impresses us to live better. So applying this, given God's maximal greatness, it is only fitting that God would guide history so that the resulting story is very good. So the great-making story qualities would be the narrative virtues. So Cain, or someone later, pioneered marital sex with human-like animals. That scores low in the virtue of livability. I'll leave that for Homer. Just think about that, okay? Cain, or someone else later, was a hero for pioneering, spreading the image of God through interbreeding with animals. This heroism doesn't fit well with Gen 4. The consistent message is Cain, or people like Cain, pioneered new evil, and we're not good guys, okay? So how about the narrative virtue of number 3? The deeper you go into the story of Genesis, the more clarity you have about the human condition. I think the deeper I study Logos theory, the less clarity I have about the human condition. And this racial inequality is a huge problem in conclusion, because it flies against the grain of Scripture's unity and equality, which we find throughout history. So the more we explore Logos theory, the more it appears inconsistent, arbitrarily contrived, and so on, which is, of course, deficient in theoretical virtues. And the story that goes with Logos theory is deficient in the narrative virtues. In other words, it's not good enough to be a story that God would have written through history and his sovereign control over history. So Logos theory is deficient in both kinds of virtues, but where the two virtues converge, narrative and theoretical, that is a great way to look for likely truth. This happens to also deepen my critique of Craig, and this is my last slide, that Craig's literary Adam, what he calls truth in the story, which I think you can detect by narrative virtues, doesn't well match with the historical Adam. But it should, because God is sovereign over history. He's writing a story in history. He's also overseeing the writing of Scripture. Thank you.